In just over a year, the notorious Dalton gang had robbed 4 trains at gunpoint. Now, the Dalton brothers and their accomplices were plotting an even bolder heist. The 5 bandits rode into Coffeyville, tied up their horses, grabbed their rifles, and crossed the street toward their targets, CM Condon Bank and the First National Bank, intending to rob both simultaneously. However, the gang had been recognized upon entering town. As they forced the bankers to open the safes, armed townsfolk gathered outside, unleashing a barrage of gunfire. Trapped, 2 gang members fled the First National Bank with a sack containing $20,000 in cash and gold, while the others tried to escape from Condon. Though the bandits shot several townspeople, all 5 were ultimately gunned down in an alley. Emmett Dalton, riddled with bullets, survived and was captured. Thus ended the reign of the Dalton gang, or so it seemed. But the story didn't stop there. Another Dalton brother, Bill, along with a group of associates, bootleggers, bandits, and killers, remained on the loose. In the Old West, men could disappear without a trace. And when the trail of an outlaw grew cold, desperate lawmen sometimes enlisted gunslingers willing to chase rewards rather than uphold the law. For reasons hard to explain, many of us are drawn to such wild and tumultuous chapters of history, as if they're windows into a different world. Maybe that's why I'm enjoying Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus so much. It combines the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40,000 with fast-paced, tactical gameplay that's incredibly engaging. Meanwhile, Frank Canton lived in the heart of gang territory. As Undersheriff of Pawnee County in the Oklahoma Territory and a deputy U.S. Marshal, he closely tracked the Dalton gang's activities. However, Canton was far from an upstanding lawman himself. There were whispers of his fondness for the bottle and penchant for brutality. He had in recent years found employ further west as a cowboy and a sheriff. His earlier story was unknown. For now, Canton had a badge and a job to do. As best as he could tell after the massacre at Coffeyville, the Dalton gang had regrouped under the leadership of members Bill Doolin and the remaining free Dalton brother. In '93, the gang shot dead 3 deputy U.S. Marshals who tried to ambush them. They later struck a bank in Pawnee and briefly kidnapped the cashier. Amidst the rampage, commissioners made unheeded calls for the governor to institute martial law. Finally, officers gunned down the last outlawed Dalton brother in June of '94, and it was proclaimed the country can now draw a sigh of relief, for the terror of the West is no more. The rest of the gang will be caught. Canton withheld celebration. Under Bill Doolin, the Doolin Gang, or the Wild Bunch, featured dangerous desperados, including cockeyed Charlie Pierce, George Bitter Creek, Newcomb, and Charles Dynamite Dick Clifton. Each crime swelled the price on their heads, and Canton wrote, "At that time there was from $1,000 to $3,000 offered for the body of each of the Wild Bunch, dead or alive." There were, of course, always smaller crimes to chase down. Canton went after a few men involved in stealing cattle and selling the meat in a butchery. One of them was Bill, or B. Dunn, leader of the Dunn brothers, whom Canton regarded as bloodthirsty thieves and pals of the Wild Bunch. Here was a chance to put a nemesis behind bars, but B proposed a deal. The Dunn brothers would help Canton take down the Wild Bunch. In return, the law would drop the cattle rustling case, and after covering mission expenses, the rewards for the outlaws would be paid to the Dunn brothers. The Dunns would become bounty hunters. Canton accepted the proposition. Reward money was most often collected by lawmen. In nearby Indian Territory, Deputy U.S. Marshal Base Reeves, born into slavery, now collected thousands of dollars chasing down murderers, bootleggers, and other outlaws. But private citizens could also collect. These irregular pursuers of fugitives were only much later termed bounty hunters. Not drifters picking up wanted posters as a profession. Bounty hunters were instead often private detectives or, like the Dunn brothers, folk familiar with the wanted, compelled to turn on them for cash. The Dunn brothers and Frank Canton held each other in mutual disdain, but Canton needed access to the Wild Bunch. He knew that outlaws could turn into phantoms on the frontier. They could travel under aliases, flee to obscure haunts, or lie low in backwater ghost towns. The U.S. had pushed across the continent in waves and spurts. The government claimed land by purchase, annexation, and removal, and people flocked far west. But by the mid-19th century, distinct and decentralized indigenous nations still reigned over the large middle expanse of the country. As settlers trespassed on a treaty territory for land and minerals, clashes with strained indigenous groups in addition to ecological devastation emboldened U.S. officials to push conciliatory chiefs and members to sign away land on behalf of entire indigenous nations, and to make war on those who would not abandon their homelands. Disease, malnutrition, and conflict cratered the indigenous population of the United States, from perhaps several million pre-contact to only 250,000 by the late 19th century, compared to some 75 million non-indigenous people. Whether they were resilient bands of Comanche and Lakota or loyal allies to the United States like the Nez Perce and Osage, indigenous peoples were forcibly relocated to small, often rundown reservations. By the 1890s, decades of displacement had created a loose frontier of U.S. settlements, known as Oklahoma Territory. This region, patrolled by lawmen like Frank Canton, was rife with outlaws. Although originally designated for relocated Native peoples, the Dawes Act of 1887 stripped indigenous nations of their rights to their own reservations, dividing land into parcels for individual Native households and opening the remainder for settlement. During the ensuing land rushes, settlers flooded these areas, staking claims and frequently disputing ownership over hastily issued titles. Across the frontier, tents and wagons quickly transformed into ramshackle towns, bustling stores, and rowdy saloons. The dream of owning and cultivating a homestead on the frontier was realized not only by male citizens, but also by immigrants, women, and formerly enslaved individuals. However, maintaining law and order proved difficult. The frontier was not only home to ruffians and bandit gangs, but also one of the most heavily armed populations in the world. A culture that resolved insults with violence and viewed cowardice with contempt often erupted in impromptu shootouts, fueled by bravado or alcohol. Yet the West was changing. Towns were being connected by telegraph wires. The gleam of steel rails, the whistle of trains, and the discovery of oil promised new wealth and progress. The age of industrial magnates like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Edison was dawning. Railroads crisscrossed the West, and businessmen introduced manufacturing while monopolistic cattle companies displaced independent cowboys. The settlers' vision of a self-sufficient life on a sprawling homestead was increasingly overshadowed by the rise of industry and the tightening grip of corporations. The desperados who robbed banks, disrupted railroads, and stole cattle from encroaching corporate powers became symbols of resistance in the eyes of many. Bill Doolin, a master of public relations, earned the goodwill of settlers by distributing grocery money to struggling families and building friendships with locals, who often warned him when lawmen were nearby. However, the Wild Bunch was far from altruistic. In early 1895, they ventured onto reservation land to steal horses from the Creek or Muskogee Nation. The indigenous residents gave chase, engaging the gang in a rolling gunfight that forced the outlaws to scatter. Frank Canton, alerted by the Dunn boys, arrived at the scene only to find the bandits long gone, hiding somewhere in the wilderness. Ever calculating, Canton told the Dunns that he and the sheriff would set up camp in the woods near their property, anticipating that some members of the Wild Bunch might eventually appear. Bitter Creek Newcomb had entrusted money to the Dunn boys, and rumors swirled that he was romantically involved with their teenage sister Rose. A week passed with no sign of the gang, but the Dunns informed Canton that 80 miles west, the Wild Bunch had robbed a train. Most of the thieves escaped, but Tulsa Jack was tracked down and killed by deputy U.S. Marshals. Among these lawmen were Heck Thomas, Bill Tillman, and Chris Madsen, legendary figures of the Wild West known as the Three Guardsmen. These relentless marshals, hunting outlaws day and night, captured or killed hundreds of the most notorious criminals. Canton, however, resented their growing reputation and success. Frustrated by the lack of progress in his alliance with the Dunn boys, he abandoned his stakeout in late April. About a week later, Bitter Creek Newcomb and cockeyed Charlie Pierce arrived at the Dunn place, setting the stage for another chapter in the Wild Bunch's tumultuous story. What can be gleaned from the muddled accounts of that night is that the outlaws never saw the sunrise. The Dunn brothers shot their friends, loaded their corpses onto a wagon, covered them in a tarp, and made for the capital of Guthrie to present their cargo to Marshal Nix. Nix had earlier approved the Dunn's ambush plan and sent Guardsman Heck Thomas and Bill Tillman to monitor from afar. The papers would run a story about how a deputy named Sam Schaefer and his posse slew the outlaws, but Schaefer was merely an alias used by one of the Dunn brothers to cover their identities. With Pierce and Newcomb dead, the Wild Bunch had no idea the Dunns had betrayed them. Canton arrived in Guthrie, feeling cheated out of his chance to capture the outlaws, and he noticed something strange about the bodies. The Dunns had claimed they waited for the outlaws to arrive and shot them when they resisted arrest, but Canton noticed the wounds were consistent with victims who were lying down, perhaps executed in their sleep. While dead or alive bounties promised reward, even if the wanted was brought in dead, they were not a license to kill. Shooting an unarmed or non-threatening fugitive could still constitute murder. In practice, however, authorities often welcomed the demise of criminals and accepted dubious justifications for the use of lethal force. The Dunn brothers' conflicting accounts went unquestioned. Judges and lawmen did not pretend to be the only participants in the business of justice. Those who professed to uphold the law often did so without a badge. The private Pinkerton Detective Agency infiltrated gangs and had procured large contracts from the government. And bounties on the heads of outlaws were often lucrative insofar as the pot had been sweetened by large companies that wanted to bring down the men who threatened their shipping and supplies. Back in '81, the famed lawman Wyatt Earp sent a telegram inquiring if the reward for a group of bandits would stand if they were brought in dead. He received confirmation it would. Earp hadn't contacted his official superior, but rather the issuers of the bounty, the express and banking company Wells Fargo. Only a few years back, Frank Canton himself had been a hired gun for a monopolistic cattle association in Wyoming, which conducted extra-legal assassinations and executions of local competitors and homesteaders whom they accused of cattle rustling. Canton was suspected of involvement in at least one murder during this so-called Johnson County War, but corrupt officials thwarted attempts to prosecute the cattle barons and their vigilantes. Canton had made a fine mercenary. One cowboy recalled, "Frank was the fastest gunman I ever knew." Life with a badge hadn't been glamorous. If rewards for wanted men served as incentive for lawmen and bounty-hunting civilians, they also introduced rivalry among them. The Dunn brothers pocketed the reward money for Pearson Newcomb without even reimbursing Canton for his personal expenses. Canton retaliated by arresting B. Dunn for aiding outlaws. The charges were dismissed, for the Dunns had gained powerful friends. They had joined the posse of Guardsmen Thomas and Tillman, pursuing the bounties on the rest of the Wild Bunch. Canton contented himself with saloon drinking by night and deputy marshal work by day. That summer he arrested 2 young girls rumored by some to have run with the Wild Bunch. The gun-toting 15 and 16-year-olds Cattle Annie and Jenny. Little Britches Stevens. Both were sent to Massachusetts, the younger to reform school, the elder to prison. Tillman arrested Little Bill Radler in September and single-handedly arrested Bill Doolin in early 1896. Officers shot Red Buck Whiteman in March, and a few months later, Texas Marshals nabbed Dynamite Dick Clifton and threw him in jail with Doolin. Yet within 2 weeks, Clifton and Doolin broke out. The feared gang leader roamed free again. B. Dunn and his brothers had a lead on where Doolin might show, a house where Doolin's wife was staying. On the night of August 26th, the guardsman Heck Thomas, for Dunn brothers, and a few other posse members lay in wait as Bill Doolin led a horse out of the stable. They shouted to him, warning him that he was surrounded. Doolin allegedly fired first, and Heck Thomas killed him with a shotgun. The Dunn brothers received shares of the $1,400 bounty, and at last it seemed that Bill Doolin's notorious Wild Bunch had met its end. Theirs was a fate that befell so many outlaws, cut down by bullets or arrested to languish in a cell or face execution. Frank Canton knew the story of a man from Texas who years back led a gang. Joe Horner, he was called. Besides his career in banditry, Horner once shot 2 black U.S. soldiers after an insult. Authorities finally threw him in a Texas prison. Then, while on a work gang in 1879, Joe Horner escaped. That was the last anyone heard of him. There were some outlaws, it seemed, who got away. Most of all, Frank Canton wanted the Dunn brothers behind bars. He regarded them as criminals, who had furthermore betrayed their arrangement and deprived him of bounty money by leading other lawmen to the Wild Bunch. In the fall of 1896, Canton revived the original cattle rustling charges and had a warrant issued for B. Dunn, while the butcher who had received the stolen cattle was imprisoned. Still working with the guardsmen, Dunn received a commission as a special deputy U.S. Marshal. Now backed by a badge, the gun-toting B. Dunn rode into Pawnee, looking for Frank Canton. A saloon keeper ducked inside, sensing trouble. Around 2 in the afternoon, Frank Canton exited a restaurant and strolled up the plank sidewalk. Folk gathered on the dusty street. B. Dunn stepped out from a stairway, now face to face with Canton. Dunn's hand rested on his revolver. He told Canton that he had it in for him, that they had a score to settle. That was the end of B. Dunn. One through the eyebrow. Canton maintained that he fired in self-defense, and he was exonerated. The legend of the showdown grew with time. Some claimed B. Dunn had drawn his gun, but his hand caught on his suspenders. Canton claimed, decades later, that Dunn had worn a steel breastplate underneath, which would have ricocheted back any shot to his torso. Embellishment had always been a hallmark of the Old West. Myths and dramatic retellings were widely published, often as the events themselves were still unfolding. Traveling Wild West shows brought these stories to life, featuring famed gunslingers and Native Americans in reenactments. Over time, historical figures and events evolved into larger-than-life characters and tropes. But the era of outlaw gangs was coming to an end. Deputy marshals eventually took down figures like Dynamite Dick Clifton. Frank Canton, too, would soon leave Oklahoma Territory as the frontier shifted. With the Klondike Gold Rush drawing people north, Canton sought a deputy marshal commission in Alaska. There he hunted for gold along the Yukon River and spent his nights in frigid boom towns, where the boundary between law and lawlessness blurred like the dust on a well-worn trail. Ironically, years earlier, the infamous Dalton brothers had themselves been deputy marshals, much like Canton. Canton, however, harbored a deep secret. His entire identity was a fabrication. His name, birth date, and origins were lies. Frank Canton was nothing more than the alias of escaped outlaw Joe Horner. Years after his escape, he clandestinely secured a pardon from the Texas governor, allowing him to remain a lawman charged with capturing killers and thieves, despite being a killer and thief who had escaped justice himself. This brings me to my brother, Joe, whose work operates at a pace 10 times faster than mine. Every one of the art pieces you've just seen represents hours of effort, guided by meticulous historical research. You can find all the links in the description. Thank you for your support.